Hey guys, it's Courtney. I'm back here with another video for Not Too Shabby using the Oh My Whiskers stamp set by Honeybee Stamps. This is the fourth and final card that we will be creating with this stamp set. So I'm going to start off by creating my background here. So I have a piece of Canson watercolor paper, and this is cut quite a bit larger than my panel itself. I'm going to be creating a long card here that fits in a standard letter envelope. I have this taped down to a board, and I'm going to start off by saturating the paper with just some clean water. I have my Arteza watercolor pan over to the side, and I'm just going to take some of the blue and the green, and I'm starting off with the top and just adding some of that blue until there's no more paint left on my paintbrush. I'm kind of just letting that spread on its own. Being the paper is wet, the color will kind of just start blending or spreading on its own as far as I wet the panel, which is the entire panel. I'm gonna do the same thing with the bottom with a green color. Again, just adding a little bit of that and letting that spread up. I didn't add quite as much green because this will kind of be my ground and the rest will be the sky. This is not a detailed background, it's just a super simple background because most of my panel is going to be covered up with my images. So next I'm going to go ahead and stamp out a ton of the images, almost all of them, at least the larger ones anyway. And I am stamping out onto a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I am using my Misty here. Not only are these images quite large, and I want to make sure that I get a good impression, but my ink pad is super dry. So if you've watched any of my recent videos, you'll probably know that. I still have not gotten a refill for my ink on 3 blackout ink. So I know that I am going to probably need to stamp this multiple times in order to get a good impression. The number of images I'm stamping at one time also plays a role in that. So I used my Misty. Like I said, going to go ahead and stamp this out a couple of times, and then we will move on to the Copic coloring. And we're going to keep the Copic coloring very similar to the ones that we have created previously with the stamp set. So I'm going to link those videos below because I'm not going to show you all of the coloring. It just gets a little repetitive. I am going to change some of the color combinations though. Going to start off with this little pail or bucket here, and because this is a round object, I am going to keep my highlight in the center. Now, the previous card that we had made using Copics, I used more bright and vibrant colors. I want this to be more of a lighter color or pastel colors. So you can see that I am using that scary dark color like I always do, but I'm really using that sparingly. Even my darkest mid-tone, which I'll go in with next, I'm using this sparingly as well. Typically, this is the kind of the color that I'll start really spreading out if I want this to be really dark and vibrant, but I'm going to save my lightest mid-tone and my lightest color to be the ones that I use the most of, if that makes any sense. So I'm just extending these flicks out a little bit further on either side of this little bucket here. I am also creating a shadow underneath their little paws where their paws are hanging over the top. Now here's the C3, which is my lightest mid-tone, and you can see that I'm extending these flicks out a lot further than I did with the previous two colors, and I'm leaving that huge center highlight for my lightest color. Normally my lightest color is one that I use sparingly, just like my darkest color, but in this case, because I want my object to appear a little bit lighter in color, I'm using more of my highlight color than I normally would. So next we're going to move on to the balloons, and I'm only going to show you the coloring of one of these. I'm starting off with my lightest color to get my paper saturated. I am going to create basically curvy lines on either side of the balloon and a little bit of shading in the center of the balloon. I'm not going up very far with that darkest color or even my darkest mid-tone. I'm not going up very far. I am leaving a little bit of a highlight area between those little curvy lines and the edge of the balloon. Now the lightest color, I'm extending these out a little bit further, well, quite a bit further, and leaving that really large area for my highlight color. So I'm going to go ahead and show you the color combinations that I used for all of these balloons, but I colored them all the same way. You can see that I have a little bit of bleeding there from my pink one, but once I go over those areas with the whatever colors I'm using for the balloons next to it, they'll kind of act as a colorless blender and kind of push that color back to where it needs to be. Remember, the lighter the color of any alcohol marker, the more it will act as a colorless blender. So those really super light colors are basically just a colorless blender with just a little bit of pigment in it. So they will react very, very similar. So once my balloons were all colored up, I am going to go ahead and color up this kite for this little centerpiece here. I guess it would be maybe the frame you'd refer to it as. I'm going to go right in with my darkest color because it's such a teeny tiny area that you don't really have to worry about the blending. It's not going to be all that noticeable. Usually small areas like that, I will go in with my darkest color first. For the main part of the kite, I'm going to concentrate my shading being towards the center where it would kind of come together, I guess. And again, just using that darkest color very, very sparingly. Same thing with the darkest mid-tone, just extending that out a teeny tiny bit. And then I'll add more of my lightest mid-tone and my lightest color. You'll see that I am using the same color combination as I did for that pink balloon. I pretty much stuck with the same color combinations that I used in the balloons for all of the images, besides the cats, naturally. So I am going to show you just one of the cats because, like I said, I've colored these cats so many times that you can definitely go back and see any of those other videos, and I don't want to bore you with too much repetitive coloring, but I will show you just this one. And again, wanted to make these a little bit lighter than my previous cards. I'm going in right with my darkest color for the warm grays because I just find that the warm grays blend very well. I don't need to saturate the paper before. I'm just creating a little bit of shadow on either side of this little cat's face. Also, where one of his legs is kind of hanging behind the rest, that would also create a shadow. Blending that out just a little bit with the W3 and then leaving that huge highlight. So majority of his body is going to be that W1. I did add a little bit of pink to the center of his ears and his nose, and then toned that pink down in his ears with that W1 again. For the butterflies, again, I stuck to the same color combinations that I used for those balloons, and I am just adding a little bit of shading basically where the wings come from the butterfly's body, I guess. So the base of the wings. And going right in with my darkest color because these are super tiny areas that I don't have to worry about saturating the paper first. So once all of my coloring was done, I went ahead and cut out all of my images with my scan and cut. And you can see when I removed my washi tape from my watercolor panel, I ripped the paper, which is not totally uncommon. Luckily, I cut the paper a lot larger than I needed to be for my card panel itself. So a majority of this I was able to cut off, but there is a teeny tiny area that's still kind of flapping around. And I'm going to try to cover up this area, but just in case, I want to make sure that this isn't going to get stuck in an envelope when I'm sticking it in an envelope or when the recipient takes it out. So I'm going to take a quickie glue pen, which is a really handy tool to have. It's really inexpensive and it works for teeny tiny areas like that, and just stick that down. While that dries, I'm going to add some white gel pen details to some of my images. I'm just going to add a little curvy line to all of these balloons just to create a little bit of a reflection. For the kite, I'm just going to add some polka dots to the main part of the kite, I guess. Now, if you are using your gel pen and you notice that it's not really flowing out very well, sometimes you'll get, if you're making polka dots, you'll get little moon shapes. Just rub that on your finger and warm up the tip of the gel pen, and you'll find that the ink flows out much, much better. So once all of my details were done with my white gel pen, I am going to go ahead and glue down my watercolor panel down to my card base. And like I said, this card base is cut so that it will fit in a standard letter envelope, using my Tombow Mono Multi Glue just because the paper is a teeny tiny bit warped, even though I did have it taped down. And then I'm going to arrange my images, my cutout images, the way I want them. Some of these will be popped up with foam tape, others will be glued flat, depending on where they are. So I know I wanted to cover up that little area where my paper ripped. So I'm going to try to put that kite right over that area just to kind of cover that up so it's not so noticeable. Once I was happy with the placement, I will go ahead and adhere everything permanently down. Like I said, I'm going to use my Scotch foam tape for, I would say, a majority of the images. And for the little kite that this one little cat is holding, the cat is popped up with foam tape, but I will use my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere that kite down. Not only do I need to tuck this under the little cat's paw, but this will give me a couple of seconds to kind of move it around and make sure that I get the correct placement using the wet glue. I popped up the little cat with the balloons up with some foam tape and then glued the little butterflies down with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue. I just put a little dot and popped those on flat. So once all of that was done, we are going to move on to the sentiment. And again, I'm going to be using the Perfect Sentiment stamp set. And this is also by Honeybee Stamps. And as you can see, I didn't leave a ton of room here. So I'm just kind of checking placement here. And I'm using one of the sentiments, but I'm going to split it in two. And you can do this one of two ways. First, you can cut your stamp, but I don't like to do that. I have done it in the past and have no issues, but I like to keep them whole. So I'm going to pop up my sentiment onto an acrylic block. I'm using a piece of Post-it note tape to mask off the first, or the part that I don't want to stamp out. Ink that up with embossing ink, stamp that down. Clean off my stamp and then mask out the other part, ink that up, remove the Post-it note tape, and then I'm going to remask with a clean piece of Post-it note tape the part I want to mask out, just in case my stamp is not completely clean. As you know, embossing powder will stick to pretty much anything, so I don't want to take the chance that there's any residue left on that stamp, so I did use another piece of clean Post-it note tape to mask that out before I stamped it. Using some Hero Arts white embossing powder here, and I went ahead and heat set that. And next I will go ahead and cut these down into small strips, just slightly larger than the sentiment itself. Going to pop these up right behind these little balloons here. And here's where I made kind of a stupid mistake, and probably we've all done something stupid like this, but luckily it's on watercolor paper, so the foam tape doesn't really stick as well until you add a ton of pressure. So the first part of the sentiment, fine. Second part of the sentiment did hang off the panel a little bit. So I was fine with that because this is a little bit smaller than the envelope itself. So it was okay if this hung a little bit off, but I had foam tape on the back. So I needed to cut off the foam tape, but instead, because I wasn't using my brain, I cut off the entire piece of the sentiment that was hanging off. So I'm missing part of my sentiment. Because I didn't add a lot of pressure to that foam tape, I was able to just rip that off and then brought back out that Scotch, or not Scotch foam tape. I brought out the black cardstock and re-stamped and re-embossed that. Next, I'm going to stick the foam tape to the card panel itself first. Snip the excess off and then tuck that sentiment strip right directly onto that foam tape. I did kind of stick that balloon down to the foam tape, so I had a little bit of issue getting that up because that's not watercolor paper, but finally was able to get that to where it belongs. So finally, we're going to go ahead and finish off the card with some sparkle, and I'm using a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen and just adding a little bit of sparkle to the balloons as well as the kite. And that is the fourth card using the Oh My Whiskers stamp set. Thank you guys so much for stopping by. I will leave all of the supplies listed below as well as the discount code to the Not Too Shabby shop. Have a great day, guys. Bye.